Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions, and I'm your host, Laura Arendt. This week, we get to talk about the profound and powerful work of philosopher Hannah Arendt. We will be speaking with Professor Lindsay Stonebridge. Professor Stonebridge is a writer, a critic, and professor of humanities and human rights at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. She's been thinking, writing, and publishing on Hannah Arendt since the 1980s and brings an incredible perspective to her recent book, We Are Free to Change the World, Hannah Arendt's Lessons in Love and Disobedience. This specific text covers a wide range of topics throughout Hannah Arendt's life. Most notably in this episode, though, we will be discussing Hannah Arendt's philosophy of thinking, the philosophy of self, and the development of the self so that one can show up in these conversations in philosophical and political contexts with authenticity and flexibility. We'll also be discussing her philosophy and work on totalitarianism and the different categories of political, personal, and social life, and how these inform Hannah Arendt's philosophy. Without further ado, let's invite Professor Lindsay Stonebridge onto Madison's Notes. Professor Stonebridge, welcome to this episode of Madison's Notes. I am so excited to be talking to you about We Are Free to Change the World, your recent book or semi-recent book on Hannah Arendt, and the subtitle is Hannah Arendt's Lessons in Love and Disobedience. And first of all, I just wanted to say I found this text a really wonderful mix of historical context and sort of biographical nature, but mixed with philosophy and infused with the conversations that were happening more broadly in 20th century philosophy. And so, yeah, thank you for creating and crafting such a compelling and engaging story, but welcome to the show.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for that overkind praise.
Well, so your book recognizes this, and I recognize this as well. Within the last 10 to 8 years, Hannah Arendt has become a more well-known philosophical figure. I just see posts of people quoting her, and generally the ethos of her work has become more widespread. I'm curious, as someone who has studied her work for a long time, you're quite intimate with the full brevity of her life and thought. Do you find that the character that is sort of forming in this current moment is an accurate portrayal of who she is in the work that she does? Or are there specific notes about her work that are becoming more prominent given our current context?
Yeah, it's a great question, because there are, of course, several Hannah Arendts. When I started reading Arendt in the 1980s and 90s, and she wasn't being widely read then. In the 70s, she was, and quite a lot of your listeners will remember that Hannah Arendt. And she was always, they're very influential figures in political theory who read her work, Habermas, Sheila Ben-Habib, and people like that. But in the 80s and 90s, she wasn't. And I was studying feminism and critical theory and psychoanalysis, and we were always talking about representation, fighting against representation. We're talking about discourse. And I read her quietly, and I loved her because she didn't talk about representation. She just came at you with this voice of clarity and insight, spoke from experience. The Hannah Arendt you're referring to, you're quite right, emerged, I think, in the 2010s. And I think there are two reasons for that. The first is Hannah Arendt's point in the mid-20th century was always to point out how broken things were. She said, we've broken the political tradition, we've broken the philosophical tradition, we've voted the moral tradition, we certainly broken the Western tradition. And her complaint was we hadn't recognized how broken politics and the world was. We hadn't noticed. And I think in the 2010s, we started to notice again. And that's one reason her work has roared back from the 20th century to our own time. She teaches us to think what happens when the banisters are broken. How do you think through? So there's that Hannah Arendt. I was going to say more trivially, but that's completely wrong. Perhaps more pertinently, the other reason is social media. And Arendt would have, one, hated social media for reasons we can talk about. She would have, where we are today with social media and its interference in politics, she would have got there far, far quicker. But what happened is, she was kind of made for Twitter. On the one hand, she's a reader of Nietzsche, so she does these brilliant aphorisms. She's infinitely quotable. There are no dangerous thoughts, thinking itself is dangerous. The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced communist or Nazi, but the person who can no longer tell the difference between wrong and right. These quotes just kept on being tweeted. And of images of her, I mean, she's incredibly striking and beautiful. She is kind of image ready. These things weren't known about. So in some ways, the Hannah Arendt that roared back in via social media was kind of a Trojan horse, because she was then there to tell us why social media was so dangerous, why brokenness was so dangerous, and what we needed to do to think through that. So to go back to your question, is there an accurate representation? Is this an accurate representation? Well, no, because Arendt's now part of a different economy of knowledge, politics, and image making. But yes, because her message is always to think through the imaging, to think through the image makers and the mind doctors and things like that. So that would be my answer.
I'm curious, so when you say, Hannah Arendt would not like social media, I have my own formations of why that might be. And my first sort of catch is her extensive letter writing. And I know that writing letters was more common during that time. And so it wasn't something crazy that she was doing, but it seemed to me she was very consistently engaging in philosophical ideas with people through letter writing. And that was her form of communicating with people who were not in the room. And that's something that I myself think would be a more interesting way to grow into, to express with my friends or colleagues, a way of writing something that isn't so formal and is a little bit more testing out the waters of certain concepts. And I'm curious, would you say that's part of it? And what else about social media would she be particularly perturbed by?
It's wonderful, yeah. No, I think you're right. Her letters are, in some ways, one of the best introductions to her work, because you can read her thinking. And if there's a publisher out there, we need to republish her letters to Karl Jaspers, because the insight they give and the sheer beauty of those letters. For Arendt, thinking was always about thinking with someone who was absent, another voice, another self. And she drew very much on Kant's idea of an enlarged mentality, which is to say, in order to understand what we think, what our opinions are about a matter, we have to engage with other opinions, other thoughts, other words, other minds. And so one of the ways you can do that is actually in solitude, when you're not in the crowd, when you're not reacting all the time. And we know this if you just think about, thinking about something your friend has said, or a lover or a professor or someone. It very rarely happens, it certainly doesn't happen if you're on social media with them, but it often happens when you're alone. Thinking, oh yeah, she said, they said this, I wonder what. And then you go. So her whole conception of thinking is based on plurality. So there are always other voices and other opinions, which are beautifully explored through letter writing, but also a kind of capacity for solitude in which one can think. So that would be one of her problems with social media. The other one would be her problem with over-sociality. I mean, she had this famous distinction between private life, social life, political life. And when I started reading Arendt, I hated that distinction. I thought it was terribly gendered and old-fashioned and unhelpful, and part of me still thinks that. But what she was worried about was that both proper political life and private life were going to get crowded out and ruined through social. So you would not have privacy of your own thoughts, privacy of your own body, privacy of your own love. And we could not have politics in terms of a kind of competitive being seen and appearing, because everything would become socialized, which is to say, we would start to conform. And I think that's the irony of social media. It used to be, do you remember Hillary Clinton, look, here comes everybody. And it wasn't, we now know here comes everybody could actually be, here comes one set of opinions and an algorithm that is going to drive those opinions. And an algorithm, moreover, that plays into emotions of insecurity, fear, and what she'd call it incoherent hatred.
Yeah, I'd love to go back to part of the first reason, in that I think she would see the inability to engage with this separate self. It can be really easy to react. We know these things about social media, but particularly on the conception that she had about how to think. And the way that she approached both that in her own life and the way that she was able to explore that, as well as the way that she then was able to share that with students. And so I'd love if you could talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah, it's a lovely question. One of her favorite quotes was from Socrates, who, of course, taught via dialogue. I mean, this is, the Socratic teaching is dialogic. It is having a conversation. And Socrates said something like, the reason I ask awkward questions is not because I know the answer. It's because I like to infect people with the perplexity that I feel myself. So, which I love that idea of what you're doing as a teacher is cultivating perplexity, not showing that you have the answer. I mean, there's a different reading of Plato and Socrates. When I read him, I think, oh my God, it does sound like you always knew the answer. So, yeah. Exactly.
That's the most frustrating kind of conversation.
Yes, exactly.
Somebody's like, I'm going to make you think that you're doing it yourself, but really, I'm controlling it.
I know. Yeah. Sort of coercive Socratic teaching, which is, it's always around power. But I think she did have that early on. But I think you're right that it was core both to her teaching practice, which she took very seriously. When you talk to those students of hers who I've talked to, and students of hers like the late Jerry Cohen, who will talk about this. I mean, she was a very, very good teacher. And yes, her idea was to teach through dialogue. And that's because her idea of thinking was predicated on the idea of dialogue. So she took from Socrates, your thinking isn't lofty thoughts. It's not being brilliant. She said some of the worst moralists, the worst people are people who think they're really good at thinking. It's a two-in-one conversation with yourself. It's the ability to have a two-in-one conversation with yourself, to listen to that other voice, to be perplexed by yourself, which is utterly Socratic. And it's the willingness, that is really ordinary. Everybody thinks in that way. Some of us are trained to think. Some of us are trained to think and then have to untrain ourselves from the way we were taught to think, because it turns out not to be that useful. Quite often we're having to think again every time we meet new circumstances. And we all have this in everyday life. You use the strategies of thinking that worked the last time, and they don't. So thinking has to be, for Arendt, always responsive to the context to change. But in order to get good at that, you have to be able to have that two-in-one conversation in your own head. And when you think about thinking, that's what most of us do. And what a good teaching is doing is what happens when you have that two-in-one conversation, and then you have that two-in-one conversation, you take it with other people who challenge your opinions, who challenge your views, who give you new evidence. And that, to her mind, would be kind of anti-totalitarian education.
Yes, I'd love to get more into the totalitarian threads in a moment, but I would love for us to clarify a little bit more strongly the way that Arendt sees thinking in comparison to some of the other Western canon. Because throughout your book and some of, I've read part of, pardon me, not the whole thing, but part of The Human Condition. And I've also studied some phenomenology with Husserl and some Heidegger. And when I read her describing thinking, it felt so much as though she was saying thinking is a way of being, as though it's yes, it's a conversation, but it's also this beingness where it's more attuned to the full picture of experience as opposed to some sort of disembodied conception of something. And that just felt in contrast to some of the other ways of thinking or thoughts about thoughts that I had gained from the other Western participants. So I would love to hear if you see her as different from the Western canon in some way, or how she maybe expands or takes in flavors from other philosophers on this particular concept.
Yeah, but she's so interesting in relation to the philosophical tradition. She's like Mary McCarthy, I think, said that she's not a conservative, she's a conservationist. So she'll take what's good and leave the rest. And that's one of the ways to understand her. That said, she does, you're quite right, Laura, she comes out of phenomenology and existentialism. And from Husserl, she takes, as all the existentialists did, it's the category of experience that matters. That is your access to truth. Truth is not something you can get beyond your own experience. It's not something that comes down to you. It is, of course, because evidence is part of experience, just all those things. but truth is in front of your nose. And that way, the world is in front of your nose. Heidegger also taught her the truth was being was thinking. That too, in one conversation with yourself, was being in time and being in language. And you have to imagine yourself sort of in the early 20th century, finding this completely mind-blowing. All the other philosophical memes, etc., sounded tired. And I often describe to my students, it's like the Wile Coyote version of philosophy. And you remember Wile Coyote runs off the cliff. He keeps on running. But it takes him a while to fall. And as you're running on nothing, there is no ground beneath you. You can see the world. You can see the pine trees below you and the sky above. So yes, it's dangerous. Thinking is dangerous. Being is dangerous. Yes, it's hazardous. But it's also amazing. That's what she took. The difference is, I think, was what she does with that in terms of politics and morals. And in this way, I think the other person that's always really important to her is Kant. She started reading very, very young.
Like 16 or something?
Yeah, 15, 16. Yeah.
Gosh, I was not reading Kant when I was 16.
Yeah, she was also doing Greek. I mean, I think you could see it. I wasn't reading Kant at 16, but there is a kind of way, and she would, remember, German was her first language, so Kant isn't easier in German, but he's more compelling in German. I could kind of see it. And I think what she took from Kant was the centrality of thinking to any type of subjectivity. And Kant taught her, one, that we think, that's it, we think, that's the ground. Kant nearly said, but didn't quite say. And also, this is the bit that's really important for her, is how we think has consequences for other human beings, which is to say, thinking is something that happens in the world that we make together. And so whereas Kant went in search for a groundwork for a metaphysics of morals, which sort of went, oh my God, it's just us thinking, quick, we've got to invent a new, a new morality, a new ethical framework in order to cope with what we could do here. She said when he did that, all he was doing was actually inviting us to do more thinking. But for her, thinking was always a moral issue, a moral consideration, as well as a philosophical and a phenomenological and an existential one. Because, as for other existentialists, for her, we think in a world of other thinking beings.
It becomes so clear to me how, from that standpoint, her thought work on totalitarianism can develop with such a strong base. I can imagine periods of time in my life when I did not consciously have that presence to have so much of an inner dialogue, or not that I didn't have it, but that I wasn't aware that that was something I got to participate in, as opposed to something that just happened, lots of different ideas floating around. And I remember being a young student and saying to some of I actually probably didn't say this out loud because that's too vulnerable in that time period, but I just don't know which thoughts are mine, because I have all these different philosophers and I've got all these different religious ideas and then there's a me somewhere in there, but where is that? And
yeah,
I can see that from actively participating in a conversation internally is when I've been able to find the most clarity and capacity to discern my own convictions, and how much less blown about by the winds of various ideas I feel. I feel that ideas can come to me and I can respond. But if you don't have that, which I haven't always had and is still not a perfected skill, it's easy for there to be ideas and cultural movements that just kind of pick you up and carry you along if you don't have this capacity to really, in the way I see it, is to be a friend to yourself.
I do think, I think this goes back to a sort of supercharged social situation. You're suddenly thinking, we're supposed to be thinking this now.
Yeah, what am I supposed to do? What's the acceptable idea? Yeah.
Do I think we should think this? Do I think this? What am I supposed to do? Yeah. But that's also, sorry to sound ancient, but there's and also to praise kind of academic authority. But it's also that for Arendt, when I got into her archive, what really didn't shock me, but I was impressed by, was her note taking. Right, she was a really good note taker. She was really professional. She was really precise. She's a proper scholar. Throughout her work, she's constantly returning to ideas, undoing, redoing. So she's not frightened. She knows that what you think yesterday will have to be undone the next day. But it's not some kind of free form poetic postmodernism, it's actually based on really knowing what the things are that she's going to think through and then think through again. So reading her, it's very, who was it? So it was Marty J. once described her work to me as being like constellations and stars, and they just come together in, it's like a force field. Her work is like a force field, and there's some ideas will come together and then blow apart again and then come together in different constellations. And I think that's so accurate. But it's a force field that's based on a pretty scholarly and a really deep familiarity of the text that she's working through, and then testing against experience, testing against what's happening in her world. So I think you're right. The importance of knowing your own mind is predicated on the ability to change your mind and to have difficult conversations with yourself and difficult conversations with other people, which is why she would always want to protect the university from politics and from intervention in politics, precisely because the university needs to be the place for the testing of ideas and the working through what it means to think. Because unless you can think for yourself, you're not going to be a good citizen in the fullest expansive sense.
I think it's something we all have the capacity for, and there are certain thought patterns, there are certain ideologies or religious practices that don't always support this empowered individual representation in the political field. I'm not trying to say that Arendt is an individualist by any means. That's clearly not the case. But there is a deep sense of commitment to the self in a way that the self can then really take responsibility for their actions in the different types of action that she classifies, across the political, private, and social landscapes. But where did this sort of conviction or commitment to her own internal world come from? Because that's not where I didn't start there. And I wonder, do you get the sense that she started with that conviction and from that was able to go forward, or was it something that she developed into and needed to cultivate in herself?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think she started early and she then saw. But she's not Camus, so she doesn't have that. I mean, she, for her, yes, the self is important, which is why privacy is so important to her thinking. But the self always happens in a community. So when she was quite young, she wrote her thesis on Augustine. And Augustine fascinated her precisely because he was the first self-narrator in that way. I'm a question mark to myself. It's brilliant. And in that kind of restless Augustine, who's so compelling rather than the rather doctrinaire Augustine. But for Augustine, also the notion of the city, the community, was so important. Precisely, you cannot be a question to yourself unless you are in a community which values one another for our questioning. So in the human condition, she'll use the idea of the daemon, that the who am I is never a question we can answer for ourselves. It's a question that can only be, answered by those who see us from behind or to the side. In some ways, we can never own that self because it's always moving with other selves. And how we reveal ourselves through our actions or through our speech is never in our control. We quite often don't know it. We don't know what we're doing in that way. I think it's a magical description of political community. You're quite right. It's nothing individualist about it. But for herself, I think I would also recommend Samantha Rose Hill, the Arendt scholar, has just done a beautiful translation of Arendt's poems. And I must admit, when I first read Arendt's poems years ago in the archive, I thought, the German romanticism written by the German philosopher. But actually having written the book and reading those poems now, kind of answers your question, Laura, of this kind of sense that, would always be a mystery to ourselves. And that's part of the human condition. What would it mean to have a politics that wasn't governed by that idea, but it allowed us to carry on being mysteries to ourselves? It's one of her questions.
When it comes to political community and her conceptions of it, she wrote some about birth, that birth was this comfortability with new life. And when a new person comes into the world, it's saying, well, we're not changing just for change's sake, but inevitably this new person will interact and bump up against all the different us's that are already moving about, and that will inevitably make different types of waves. And particularly when you were describing her experiences in Athens, it sounded like you were looking at a stele. And I would just love if you could share some of those reflections about her approach to what is the basis for political community, because that struck me as different. And last week I interviewed someone on Tolkien, and it was a wonderful conversation. But through that process, I learned that I believe it was Hume who said the basis of political community is a war camp. And like, that's the origin of a city. And I was like, a person who is not thinking about children or family or community or any of the joys of being like, I was like, you would say that, Hume, you would. So, but I would just love if you could tell us a little bit more about how she approached the basis of political community, because I think that really sets us up well to understand, the impact of totalitarianism and some of these other ills that she's so deeply committed to fighting against.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's kind of behind the mystery of we are free to change the world, when self-evidently not many of us are. But in terms of the human condition, every new life, as you said, when the new people come, that's uncontrollable. You're setting something in motion which is new. And so a kind of community that affirms natality is not going to be afraid of the new or of change. I mean, every new parent knows this. Like, capacity for complete change in ways that are not predictable. It's why those sort of childcare books are hilarious. Don't get the fundamental fact that, what she's talking about, there's going to be contingency and there's going to be change, but because there is birth. Unto us a child is born, a new beginning. With that, though, comes, like, if we're going to base all of our politics on new people and change, this would be chaos. Could be like a free school in the 1970s where there are no rules and we just do change. And all the kids end up stoned all the time, killing themselves. And the usual answer to this is the Hobbes answer, is that's why we need sovereign power. That's why we need to give up power so we don't end up like, nasty stoned, or not stoned children, but nasty drugged up children killing one another. And she doesn't go down that route. And in the human condition, she says, so how do we cope with the fact that in order to be together, to have a political issue, to make a world, we have to let change in, we have to let creativity in. And this is wonderful. This is the everyday miracle of freedom, right? And the revolution she loved are the ones no one saw coming. And she said, well, you need two things for political community to work. You need promises and forgiveness. When I first read this, I thought, what? Where's sovereign violence? Where's governance? What she meant, promises, first of all, she's taking this from Nietzsche. And Nietzsche had this lovely formulation. He says, well, promises are the memory of the will. And so what Nietzsche's saying is you can't actually, the will to power is a dangerous thing. You can't just make the world to be in a certain way. That is fascism. That is totalitarianism. But you have to make the world safe. So what you do is you promise you will try. And I didn't really understand this until I had kids. I mean, most parents will their kids to be well, will their kids to be fine. But you also know you can't do that because that's not how the world works. So what you say to your children is, I promise I will try and do this. I promise I will try and bring taxes down. I promise you, whatever, I promise I will try and make your kids safe. I promise I will reform. I will try and reform gun law, etc. So that's what she meant by promise. In order to have a political future. Forgiveness, which I really found, I wasn't a very forgiving person in my youth. She said, we have to have the capacity for forgiveness, otherwise no one will do anything. And the other thing that I hadn't realized until I read the book is her concept of forgiveness is very politically radical. What she draws from is early Christian forgiveness. She says why that was so radical was that it was anti-authoritarian, which is to say you could only forgive in a community. Not one God, not one Pharaoh, not yourself. I always get very kind of like, what does it mean to forgive yourself? So thinking together in a plurality is what guarantees forgiveness. True forgiveness can only happen. It's a very Christian concept, actually, within a community. And I think that's very powerful. So those two very slim things that might empower us to keep the change, to keep love, to keep newness, to keep natality, without the danger. I mean, she's no anarchist. I mean, she believes in the law, Arendt. She believes in fences. There are some borders that we have to keep. There are some we have to get rid of, but there are some we have to keep. There will have to be some rules in the game. She's a political theorist. Of course, there have to be rules in the game. But her definition of those is, as you say, although she had quite a lot of time for human and a lot of time for Hobbes, it's a very, very different emphasis from what we usually find.
This brings me to more of a present day application of this, because that sounds really intriguing. It sounds delightful. It sounds charitable and generous, but not like some sort of unfettered subjectivism. It's contextual and embedded in community. And also, we kind of have a community problem in our modern life where there's lots of political communities where the participants don't share a common understanding of their experience. They don't even share a common experience, and yet we're trying to participate in political community. So is it possible to do so if there's, only if there's sort of a shared basis? Or what does it mean to be continuing in these political communities, but not sort of sharing the types of bases that used to be assigned to political groups and political community?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great question. I think it does take us a little bit back to the role of propaganda in Arendt's time and in our own time. In her essay on truth and politics, she makes the point where she talks about factual truth. And what grounds a community is not necessarily shared values, because we're always going to be different. People are always going to have different opinions. I mean, this is the Madison show, right? Was it Madison? All government rests on opinion. Here we are. And she quotes that actually in this essay. But it doesn't mean that it's the same opinion, because that would not be democracy. It would not be properly Republican. It would not be all the things. So in order to have a community, what you do not need, of course you have groups that identify and each to their own. In order for plurality to work, and Arendt's constant thing is the human condition is plural. What we need is a politics that can respond to that plurality and keep that plurality, because it's infinitely, infinitely precious. So you're not going to get the same opinions. But what we do need is a common ground, and the common ground is factual truth. And factual truth goes back to your earlier point, which is why she's a phenomenologist. It's the truth we experience. And it's the truth that we experience in such a way that we can share it with others. Of course, there are all different sorts of truth. There's philosophical truth, there's mathematical truth, there's religious truth. But actually, in terms of community, it's factual truth that matters. She's going to talk about politics at this point. This is just after the scandal, after her reporting the Eichmann trial, where she was accused of all sorts of things she simply didn't say. So she would, and she later wrote in the wake of Pentagon Papers and the Watergate scandal, how she carried on writing about this fact. The politics is often the enemy of factual truth. And always has been. It's not like when people say now politics is just lying, it always has been. Right? But, in some ways, because it's rhetoric, philosophers deal with dialogue, politicians deal with rhetoric, and what they're trying to do is manipulate facts to get for power. Right? What she saw as happening in the 20th century is something changing, where the actual factual truth was opposed to a new thing called the deliberate political lie. So it's not just a question of rhetoric. It's the deliberate lie that makes you doubt the ground of experience. And this is what George Orwell wrote about in 1984. It's what Arendt wrote about in Emergence of Totalitarianism. And it's absolutely key, because we can't have a debate about different opinions or debate about how we want to run our national communities unless we have certain agreements of what is a factual truth. Climate change might be a really good test case of this. If you simply think, you just simply lie about the evidence that people are actually experiencing, as well as what the scientific truth, there's experiential truth. If you simply say no, or if you lie about, you tell bald-faced lies about, I don't know, off the top of my head, migration. You're not just doing politics to get power. Well, that's pretty much all you're doing. You're disturbing the factual truth. And if you do that, we can't have a community. And it's that point where the deliberate political lie and the deliberate political liars are proto-totalitarians, because they're a new breed, not of politics. That's not politics, it's anti-politics, which she saw as the greatest threat. So to back to your question, I think it's great to have, and this is why she loved America, it's great to have a nation where you have loads of different political communities, where you don't have to assimilate, where you don't, because you sign up to this idea of plurality. This is a great idea, right? But you're not going to keep that idea if you mess with the factual truth.
Yeah, and this is so tricky because to engage in politics, you'll inevitably come up against those who are promoting a deliberate lie, whatever that lie is. And yet there's this commitment or desire to still engage with it and have conversations with people. And there's a huge virtue in being able to and benefiting from having these sorts of open dialogues with people. And of course, Arendt was very famous for this, but...
No, it goes back to the point you started. It's just like, it's not that you know your opinion. You put this so beautifully. This is what it means to be a student and a thinker. Until you're in dialogue with other people. This is like your opinions are being tested or reinforced or questioned. This is what really good politics can do. Is my opinions often get stronger when I'm in opposition to someone else.
Yeah, well, no, you feel that pushback, and then you know the difference between where you start and where you end.
But the amount of times I've heard people say, and this is on, what I count as my side as well as their side, is what you're experiencing is not true.
Yeah.
And I think that's so unhelpful. It's even if what you think is true is not true. It is being experienced as truth. Therefore, we have to go in there and dig and see why that's experienced as truth.
Yeah, the surefire way to kill a mutually beneficial discussion is to just show up and say, well, whatever you say is your experience is wrong.
Yeah.
Well, and I want to talk about this interchange because there's a lot of political division. The idea of having conversations across the aisle is not always very attractive. It's not, given the ethos of our more recent political activity. And so, but Arendt had friends who were, or connections, or I'm thinking about Heidegger right now. More than a friend. No, but she was deeply involved with some individuals who were so against what she stood for at moments in time. And I just would love to hear from your scholarship of Arendt, like, what do we do when somebody crosses the line, and what do we call the line? Because it seems like in our current political state, at least here in the States, the lines are very easy to cross, and you don't always know where they are. And, whether it doesn't matter who you're talking to, there's just a high sensitivity of where the lines are. And I would love to hear what you think Arendt might say to this, since she had her own experiences with connections who crossed the line.
Yeah. The amount of times when I've been on tour, the amount of times the Heidegger question comes up, and I've never heard anyone say, what do you think of Heidegger being involved with this totally brilliant woman who used your philosophy to argue tacitly against you? Not once. There's a gendered issue to the Heidegger question coming up again and again and again with Arendt, because the misogyny, which we haven't talked about in another episode, the misogyny that surrounds Hannah Arendt to this day is extraordinary, which is not to say it's not problematic. And I also say in the book, like many Arendt scholars, what she did is she totally wrote him out of her life. She wrote cuttingly about his betrayal of existentialism and his philosophy by his joining the Nazi Party. When she first went back to Germany as part of a Jewish reconstruction program, which she was collecting stolen, looted Judaica, she wrote him a note in Freiburg and said, I'm back in town, and he turned up. And their friendship and relationship began again, a different time. She might say, the first thing she would say is, this was a love affair, this was my private life. So where do we draw the lines, in which domain do we draw the lines? And part of our politics would be to protect our private lives and our capacity to make mistakes in our private lives. Just because the personal is political, which is the slogan that my thinking was formed through, it doesn't mean it has to be. A freer world might be one in which the personal was not political, especially for women. Like, get out of my face, get off my body, get out of my life, stop judging me. So there's that. I think also, it was a great love affair. And Samantha Rose Hill told me on Hannah Arendt's desk, because she walked in Riverside Terrace at Riverside Drive apartment, there were two photos on her desk. One was of her husband, Heinrich Bucher, and the other was of Martin Heidegger. So I don't see that as a question that you can understand in Arendtian terms, which isn't to say you can't understand it in other terms. But I also sort of like, what happens to politics when we start to talk about crossing lines in terms of individuals and personal life is kind of the wrong question.
Ooh, what's the right question?
The right question is, who's drawing the lines? Who's really crossing the lines? Are the people who have power? And the people who have power. And what we tend to do is we like to sort of say, well, he's a racist, she's a fascist, she's a communist, he's a blah. They've crossed the line. Without asking, which we really need to ask today, what are the structural and economic conditions that are setting these lines? If you say, what are which are, I would say, structural inequality and structural racism. So it doesn't, so what? Yeah, we all know that certain characters are making Nazi salutes because they actually kind of get off on that stuff. That's not really, I don't care. What I care about is the economic, social, and political structures of the United States, which are actually creating these lines which are now being crossed. That's what we should be caring about.
What are the characteristics that you or Arendt might say are necessary or at least helpful in engaging in these conversations where we get to ask who's drawing these lines and where are they, and getting to brush them off and redraw them or what have you? What are the characteristics of the individual that can help create environments where these types of conversations are engaged and successful in that both people walk away going, I'm perplexed.
The willingness, the capacity to tolerate perplexity is important. I think that is one of the the renting characteristic features. A capacity to tolerate and see reality. I mean, she once described comprehension as a facing up to reality, whatever it is, which quite often isn't what you want it to be. There will be, contradictions. There will be things you haven't seen before that you shouldn't be too quick to name without watching. I really think, in the battle of analogies and memes, we need to pay attention to that. On a more personal level, the capacity for friendship is hugely important to Hannah Arendt. She was a very, very good friend, a very passionate friend. She kept friends for life. She lived by those friendships. That was partly because she was a refugee. She was a survivor of Nazi totalitarianism. So friendship, in some way, the ties that bind us are all we've got when you take away political community, political structure, and things like that. But she would also say, that's all we've got, love and friendship. They're the first lines of resistance against totalitarianism, love and friendship for Arendt. But they're also the basis for new politics, because love and friendship teach us about difference. They teach us about plurality. They teach us about conversation. They teach us about difficulty.
Well, and we've been able to get such a beautiful view, though albeit short, on Arendt, who's so complex, and her whole lifespan is fascinating. So for our listeners, I highly encourage you to pick up this book. And I just want to say I really appreciate your scholarship in this. And I'm also curious who some of your friends have been in your own experience of bumping up in the world and drawing lines and investigating them. And I'm not trying to ask a private question, but maybe edging on the border of social question or, academic.
I mean, I think I was very lucky to have a political formation in the 80s because I was brought up by a lot of really brilliant women. Jacqueline Rose, I read and met Judith Butler when I was quite young. And the women who were committed to a certain kind of feminism. And the older I get, my next book is on old women, by the way. The older I get, I realize that Hannah Arendt once said, no one understands the political realm better than those who are forced to walk around it from the outside. I think my friends are people who, for various reasons, whether class, I'm first generation, university, gender, sexuality, in some ways I think that the relationship between queer studies and Hannah Arendt is yet to be properly thought through, but there's a lot there. It's very significant that her key conversations were with James Baldwin and Auden, are the people who walked from the outside and stuck onto that outsiders because they understood that you actually see a certain kind of truth when you do not have power. Those are my favourite friends. I'm thinking of them now as you ask that question. If they're listening, I hope they know that they are. But also Hannah Arendt's been my friend. But sometimes a really annoying friend who I wish would say one thing and stick to it and write a bit more clearly and not leave me a little kind of like, my friend who didn't send a letter to Heidegger in 1940, she's that friend. But yeah, and women writers and thinkers.
Well, Lyndsay, thank you so much for this time. It has been really wonderful to chat with you. And I know our listeners will enjoy it as much as I have. So,
my pleasure, Laura.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode of Madison's Notes with Lindsay Stonebridge on Hannah Arendt. If you like what you heard, you can follow us on all major podcast platforms and find us on social media at the James Madison Program. Make sure to send this episode to a friend or a foe and join us next week for another episode. My name is Laura Arendt, and this has been Madison's Notes.